Alright, let's see if I can get in another chapter before my roommate has people over. I mean, I think some of them are already here, but I don't think they'll care. Alright, False Pretenses, July to November 1884. I said it right this time. Prospero the Enchanter gives no formal reason for his retirement from the stage. His tours have been so sporadic in recent years that the lack of performances passes mostly without notice. But Hector Bowen still tours, in a manner of speaking, even if Prospero the Enchanter does not. He travels from city to city, hiring out his 16-year-old daughter as a spiritual medium. "I hate this, Papa," Celia protests frequently. "If you can think of a better way to bide your time before your challenge begins, and don't you dare say reading, then you are welcome to it, provided it makes as much money as this does. Besides, it's good practice for you to perform in front of an audience." Buddy, you're insufferable. "These people are insufferable," Celia says, though it is not exactly what she means. They make her uncomfortable. The way they look at her, the pleading glances and the tear-streaked stares, they see her as a thing, a bridge to their lost loved ones that they so desperately cling to. They talk about her as though she's not even in the room, as if she is as insubstantial as their beloved spirits. She must force herself not to cringe when they inevitably embrace her, thanking her through their sobs. "These people mean nothing," her father said. "Dude, you need to get your head out of your ass. They cannot even begin to grasp what it is they think they see and hear, and it is easier for them to believe they are receiving miraculous transmissions from the afterlife. Why not take advantage of that, especially when they are so willing to part with their money for something so simple?" Men. Celia maintains that no amount of money is worth such excruciating experiences, but Hector's insistent, and so they continue to travel, levitating tables and producing phantom knocking on all manner of well-papered walls. She remains baffled by the way their clients crave the communication, the reassurance. Not once has she ever wished to contact her departed mother, and she doubts her mother would want to speak with her if she could, especially through such complicated methods. "This is all a lie," she wants to say to them. "The dead are not hovering nearby to knock politely at teacups and tabletops and whisper through billowing curtains." She occasionally breaks their valuables, placing the blame on restless spirits. It's adorable. Her father picks different names for her as they change locales, but he uses Miranda often, presumably because he knows how much it annoys her. After months of it, she is exhausted from the travel and the strain and the fact that her father barely lets her eat, as he claims that looking like a waif makes her seem more convincing, closer to the other side. Only after she genuinely faints during a session, oh my god, dude, rather than perfectly executing the choreographed dramatic swoon, does he relent to a respite at their home in New York. At tea one afternoon, in between glares at the amount of jam and clotted cream she's slathering on her scones, "You eat, girl, you eat how much you want," he mentions that he has contracted her services for the weekend to a weeping widow across the town who has agreed to pay twice her normal rate. "Okay. I said you could have a rest," her father says when Celia refuses, not even looking up from the pile of papers he has spread across the dining table. "You've had 3 days. That should suffice. You look fine. You're going to be even prettier than your mother someday." "I'm surprised you remember what my mother looked like," Celia says. Do you?" Her father asks, glancing up at her and continuing when she only frowns in response. "I may only have spent a matter of weeks in her company, but I remember her with more clarity than you do, and you had her for 5 years. Time is a peculiar thing. You'll learn that eventually." Dude, why are you so fucking condescending? What crawled up your ass and died? Okay, sorry. He returns his attention to his papers. "What about this challenge you're supposedly training me for?" Celia asks, "or is that just another way for you to make money?" "Celia, dearest," Hector says, "you will have great things ahead of you, but we have relinquished control of when they will begin. Our side does not have the first move. We will simply be notified when it is time to put you on the board, as it were. Then why does it matter what I do in the meantime? You need the practice." Celia tilts her head, staring at him as she puts her hands on the table. All of the papers fold themselves into elaborate shapes, pyramids and helixes and paper birds with rustling wings. Her father looks up, annoyed. He lifts a heavy glass paperweight and brings it down on her hand, hard enough to break her wrist with a sharp crack. The papers unfold and flutter back to the surface of the table. You need the practice, he repeats. Your control is still lacking. Celia leaves the room without a word, holding her wrist and biting back tears. And for Christ's sake, stop crying, her father calls after her. It takes her the better part of an hour to set and heal the shards of bone. I'm gonna murder Hector Bowen. I'm gonna murder him. I'm going to kill him. Isabel sits in a rarely occupied armchair in the corner of Marco's flat, a rainbow of silk ribbon twisted around her fingers as she attempts to invade and to form it into a single elaborate braid. This seems so silly, she remarks, frowning at the tangle of ribbon. It's a simple charm, Marco says from his desk where he sits surrounded by open books. A ribbon for each element, bound with knots and intent. It's like your cards, only influencing the subject instead of simply divining its meaning. But it won't work if you don't believe it will. You know that. Perhaps I'm not in the proper mood to believe it, Isabel says, loosening the knots and putting the ribbons aside, letting them cascade over the arm of the chair. I'll try again tomorrow. Help me then, Marco says, looking up from his books. Think of something, an object, a significant object that I cannot possibly know about. Isabel sighs, but she immediately closes her eyes, concentrating. It's a ring, Marco says after a moment, picking the image out of her mind as easily as if she had drawn him a picture. A gold ring with a sapphire flanked by 2 diamonds. Isabel's eyes snap open. How did you know that? She asks. Is it an engagement ring? He counters with a grin. She clasps her hand to her mouth before she nods. You sold it, Marco says, picking up the fragments of memory attached to the ring itself. In Barcelona. You fled an arranged marriage. That's why you're in London. Why did you not tell me? It's not exactly a topic of proper conversation, Isabel says. And you hardly tell me anything about yourself. You could have fled an arranged marriage of your own. They stare at each other for a moment, while Marco tries to come up with an appropriate response, but then Isabel laughs. He probably looked for the ring longer than he looked for me, she says, glancing down at her bare hand. It was such a lovely thing. I almost didn't want to part with it, but I had no money and nothing else to sell. Marco starts to say he can tell she received a good price for the ring, but then there's a knock on the door of the flat. Is it the landlord? Isabel whispers, but Marco puts a finger to his lips and shakes his head. Only one person ever knocks upon that door unannounced. Marco waves Isabel into the adjoining study before he answers. The man in the gray suit does not enter the flat. He has never entered the space since he orchestrated the transition, pushing a student out into the world. He's never touched him. He's never gone into his apartment. I feel like there's a significance to his actions, but I don't know what it is yet. Okay. You will be applying for a position to work for this man, he says, without greeting, taking a faded business card from his pocket. You will likely need a name. I have a name, Marco says. The man in the gray suit does not inquire as to what it might be. Your interview is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. I have handled a number of business matters for Monsieur Lefebvre of late, and I have put in a strong recommendation, but you should do whatever is needed to secure the position. Is this the beginning of the challenge? Marco asks. This is a preliminary maneuver to place you in an advantageous position. Then when does the challenge start? Marco asks, though he has asked the question dozens of times before and never received a firm answer. That will be clear at the time, the man in the gray suit says. When it does begin, it would be wise for you to focus your attention on the competition itself. His eyes move pointedly to the closed door of the study, without any distractions. He turns and exits down the hall, leaving Marco standing in the doorway, reading and rereading the name and the address on the faded card. Hector Bowen eventually relents to his daughter's insistence that they remain in New York, but he does so for his own purposes. While he makes occasional comments that she should be practicing more, for the most part he ignores her, spending his time alone in the upstairs parlor. If that's not suspicious, I'm a cat. Celia is quite pleased with the arrangement and spends most of her time reading. She sneaks out to bookstores, surprised when her father does not inquire as to where the piles of freshly bound volumes come from. And she does practice, often, breaking all manner of things around the house in order to put them back together again, making books fly around her room like birds, calculating how far they can travel before she must adjust her technique. She becomes quite adept at manipulating fabric, altering her gowns as expertly as a master tailor to accommodate the weight she has regained, her body feeling like her own again. She has to remind her father to come out of the parlor for meals, though lately he has refused more and more often, barely leaving the room at all. Today he will not even respond to her insistent knocking. Irritated, and knowing he has charmed the lock so she cannot unlatch them without his own keys, she kicks the door with her boot, and to her surprise, it swings open. Her father stands by a window, intently watching his arm as he holds it out in front of him, the sunlight filtering in through the frosted glass and falling over his sleeve. His hand fades completely, and then returns. He stretches his fingers, frowning at the audible creaking of the joints. "What are you doing, Papa?" Celia asks, curiosity trumping her annoyance. It is not something she has seen him do before, either on stage or in the privacy of her lessons. "Nothing to concern yourself with," her father says, pulling the frilled cuff of his shirt down over his hand. The door slams shut in her face. Honestly, I shouldn't be surprised. All right. Target practice. London, December 1884. The dartboard hangs precariously on a wall in the study, between tall bookcases and ornately framed oil paintings. It is almost camouflaged in the shadows despite its bold pattern, but the knife reaches its target each and every time it is thrown, very near the bullseye that is obscured by the newspaper clipping pinned to the board. The clipping is a theatrical review, an article carefully removed from the London Times. It is a positive review. Some might call it glowing. Nevertheless, it has been put in this position of execution, and the silver-handled knife is being thrown at it. The knife slices through the paper and sinks into the cork of the dartboard. It is retrieved and removed, only to have the process repeated again. The knife is being thrown gracefully from the handle, so it rotates over and over perfectly until the tip of the blade finds its mark. By Chandresh Christophe Lefebvre, whose name is printed in clear typeset letters in the last line of the aforementioned newspaper clipping. The sentence that holds his name is the particular one that has incensed Monsieur Lefebvre to the point of knife throwing. A single sentence reads thusly: M. Chandresh Christophe Lefebvre continues to push the boundaries of the modern age, dazzling his audiences with spectacle that is almost transcendent. That sounds nice. Most theatrical producers would likely be flattered by such a remark. They would clip the article for a scrapbook of reviews, quote it for references and referrals, but not this particular theatrical producer, no. M. Chandresh Christophe Lefebvre instead focuses on that penultimate word. Almost. Almost. The knife flies across the room again, over furniture of velvet and intricately carved wood, passing perilously close to a crystal decanter of brandy. It somersaults swiftly, handle over blade, and finds itself buried in the dartboard once again. This time it pierces the now nearly shredded paper in between the words audiences and spectacle, obscuring the with completely. Chandresh follows in the wake of the knife, pulling the blade from the board carefully, but with a fair amount of force. He walks back across the room, knife in one hand, a glass of brandy in the other, and turns swiftly on his heel, letting the knife fly once more, aiming for that horrible word, almost. Clearly, he must be doing something wrong. If his productions are merely almost transcendent, when the possibility of true transcendence exists somewhere nearby, waiting to be attained, then there is something else that must be done. He has been pondering this ever since the review was placed on his desk, neatly clipped and labeled by his assistant. Additional copies have been filed elsewhere for posterity and safekeeping, as the desk copies often meet such gruesome fates, while Chandresh agonizes over every word. My God, that sounds like something I do. If I ever publish anything, this is what's going to happen to me. I'm going to read all the bad reviews and I'm going to be like, oh God. Chandresh relishes reactions. So do I. In fact, that is why I am doing this. Well, not only. Genuine reactions, not mere polite applause. He often values the reactions over the show itself. A show without an audience is nothing, after all. In the response of the audience, that is where the power of performance lives. Aww. He was raised in the theater, sitting in boxes at the ballet. Being a restless child, he quickly grew bored with the familiarity of the dances and chose instead to watch the audiences, to see when they smiled and gasped, when the women sighed and when the men began to nod off. So perhaps it is not terribly surprising that now, many years later, he still has more interest in the audience than in the performance itself. Though the performance must be spectacular in order to coerce the best reactions. Coerce reactions. It's a funny way to put it. And because he is incapable of observing the faces of every audience member at every performance of every show, shows that range from compelling drama to exotic dancing girls and a few that creatively combine the two, oh, that's cool, he relies on the reviews. Though there has not been a review in some time that vexes him the way that this particular one does, and certainly not one in years that provoked knife throwing. The knife flies once again, this time piercing the word stage. Chandresh goes to retrieve it, sipping his brandy on the way. He regards the nearly decimated article curiously for a moment, peering at the almost illegible words. Then he bellows for Marco. Darkness and stars. Oh man, I have to show you. I have to show you how this looks because it's so pretty. I love that heading. Alright. With your ticket in hand, you follow a continuous line of patrons into the circus, watching the rhythmic motion of the black and white clock as you wait. Beyond the ticket booth, the only way forward is through a heavy striped curtain. One by one, each person passes through it, vanishing from sight. When it is your turn, you pull back the fabric and step forward, only to be engulfed by darkness as the curtain closes again. It takes your eyes a few moments to adjust, and then tiny dots of light begin appearing like stars, lining the dark walls in front of you. And while moments before you were so close to your fellow circus-goers that you could have touched them, now you are alone as you feel your way tentatively forward through a maze-like tunnel. The tunnel twists and turns, the tiny lights providing the only illumination. You have no way of discerning how far you have gone or which direction you're moving in. Finally, you reach another curtain. Fabric that feels as soft as velvet beneath your hands parts easily when you touch it. The light on the other side is blinding. Oh, I love these little descriptions. Oh my god! Here comes the introduction of one of my favorites. I mean, they're all my favorite, but I love this character. Truth or Dare, Concord, Massachusetts, September 1897. So, I think we've skipped quite a few years. They sit in the oak tree in the afternoon sun, the 5 of them. His sister Caroline on the highest branch because she always climbs the highest. Her best friend Millie perches below. The Mackenzie brothers, throwing acorns at the squirrels, are somewhat lower than that, but not low enough to be considered anything but high. He is always on the low branches, not for fear of heights, but for where he ranks in the group when he is allowed to be part of it. Being Caroline's younger brother is both a blessing and a curse. That way, Bailey is sometimes allowed to join them, but always kept in his place. Truth or Dare, Caroline calls from the upper branches. She receives no reply, so she drops an acorn directly on her brother's head. Truth or Dare, Bailey, she repeats. Bailey rubs his head through his hat. Maybe the acorn makes him choose the way he does. Truth is a resigned response, a yielding to Caroline's abusive nut-throwing version of the game. Dare is marginally more defiant. Even if he's humoring her, at least he's not a coward. It seems like the right thing to say, and he feels rather proud of himself when it takes Caroline a moment to respond. She sits on her branch some 15 feet above him, swinging her leg and looking off over the field while she formulates the dare. The Mackenzie brothers continue to torment the squirrels. Then Caroline smiles and clears her throat to make her proclamation. Bailey's dare, she starts, making it his own and no one else's, binding it to him. He begins to feel uneasy before she even says what the dare actually consists of. She pauses dramatically before declaring, Bailey's dare is to break into the Night Circus. Millie gasps. The Mackenzie brothers stop their acorn throwing and look up at her, squirrels abruptly forgotten. A huge smile spreads across Caroline's face as she stares down at Bailey, and brings something back as proof. She adds, unable to keep the hint of triumph out of her voice. It is an impossible dare, and all of them know it. Bailey looks out across the field to where the circus tents sit like mountains in the middle of the valley. It's so still in the daytime, with no lights and no music and no crowds of people. Just a bunch of striped tents, looking more yellow and gray than black and white in the afternoon sun. It looks odd, perhaps a bit mysterious, but not extraordinary, not in the middle of the day, and not terribly scary, Bailey thinks. We'll do it, he says. He jumps down from his low branch and starts across the field, not waiting to hear their replies, not wanting Caroline to retract the dare. He is certain she expected him to say no. An acorn whizzes by his ear, but nothing else. And for reasons Bailey cannot quite put words to, he is walking towards the circus with a considerable amount of determination. Ooh. It looks just as it did the first time he saw it, when he was not quite 6 years old. It materialized in the same spot then, and now it looks like it never left, as though it were merely invisible for the 5-year period when the field sat empty. At the age of not quite 6, he was not allowed to visit the circus. His parents deemed him too young, and he could only stare from afar, enchanted at the tents and the lights. He had hoped it would stay long enough for him to age properly into old enough, but it vanished without notice after 2 weeks, leaving too young Bailey heartbroken. But now it has returned. It arrived only a few days ago and is still a novelty. Had it been present for longer, Caroline likely would have chosen a different dare, but the circus is currently the talk of the town, and Caroline likes to keep her dares en vogue. The night before had been Bailey's first proper introduction to the circus. It was like nothing he had ever seen. The lights, the costumes, it was all so different, as though he had escaped his everyday life and wandered into another world. He had expected it to be a show, something to sit in a chair and watch. He realized quickly how wrong he was. It was something to be explored. He investigated it as best as he could, although he felt woefully unprepared. He did not know what tents to choose out of dozens of options, each with tantalizing signs hinting at the contents. And every turn he took through the twisting striped pathways led to more tents, more signs, more mysteries. He found a tent full of acrobats and stayed amongst them as they twirled and spun until his neck ached from staring up. He wandered through a tent full of mirrors and saw hundreds and thousands of Baileys staring, wide-eyed, back at him, each in matching gray caps. Even the food was amazing. Apples dipped in caramel so dark they appeared almost blackened, but remained light and crisp and sweet. Chocolate bats with impossibly delicate wings, the most delicious cider Bailey had ever tasted. Okay, now I'm hungry. Everything was magical, and it seemed to go on forever. None of the pathways ended. They curved into each other, or circled back to the courtyard. He could not possibly describe it. He could not properly describe it afterward. He could only nod when his mother asked if he'd enjoyed himself. They didn't stay as long as he would have liked. Bailey would have stayed all night if his parents had let him. There were still so many more tents to explore, but he was ushered home to bed only after a few hours, consoled with promises that he could go back the next weekend, though he anxiously recalls how quickly it disappeared before. He ached to go back almost the moment he walked away. He wonders if he accepted the dare, in part, to return to the circus sooner. It takes Bailey the better part of 10 minutes to walk all the way across the field, and the closer he gets, the larger and more intimidating the tents look, and the more his conviction fades. He's already trying to come up with something he can use as proof without having to go in when he reaches the gates. The gates are easily 3 times his height. The letters atop it spelling out Le Cirque de Rêve are almost indiscernible in the daylight, each one perhaps the size of a rather large pumpkin. The curls of iron around the letters do remind him of pumpkin vines. There's a complicated-looking lock holding the gates shut and a small sign that reads, "Gates open at nightfall and close at dawn." In swirly lettering under that, in tiny plain... Oh, that was in swirly lettering. And under that, in tiny plain letters, "Trespassers will be exsanguinated." Bailey doesn't know what exsanguinated means, but he doesn't much like the sound of it. The circus feels strange in the daytime, too quiet. There's no music, no noise, just the calls of nearby birds and the rustling of leaves in the trees. There doesn't even appear to be anyone there, as though the whole place is deserted. It smells like it does at night, but fainter, of caramel and popcorn and smoke from the bonfire. Bailey looks back across the field. The others are still in the tree, though they look tiny from so far away. They are undoubtedly watching, so he decides to walk around to the other side of the fence. He is no longer entirely certain he wants to do this, and if and when he does, he doesn't particularly want to be watched. That's understandable. Most of the fence past the gate borders the edges of tents, so there isn't really anywhere to enter. Bailey keeps walking. A few minutes after he loses sight of the oak tree, he finds a part of the fence that is not right up against the tent, but borders a small passageway, like an alley between them, wrapping around the side of one tent and disappearing around a corner. It's as good a place as any to try to get in. Bailey finds that he does actually want to go inside, not just because of the dare, but because he's curious, dreadfully, hopefully curious. And beyond proving himself to Caroline and her gang, beneath the curiosity, there is that need to return tugging at him. The iron bars are thick and smooth, and Bailey knows without trying he will not be able to climb over. Besides the fact that there are no good footholds past the first few feet, the top of the fence curls outward in swirls that are something like spikes. They are not overly intimidating, but they're definitely not welcoming. But the fence was apparently not built with the express purpose of keeping 10-year-old boys out, for while the bars are solid, they are spread almost a foot apart, and Bailey, being somewhat small, can squeeze through comparatively easily. He does hesitate just for a moment, but he knows he'll hate himself later if he doesn't at least try, no matter what might happen after. He had thought it would feel different, the way it had at night, but he pulls himself through the fence and stands in the passage between the tents. He feels exactly as he had on the outside. If the magic is still there in the daytime, he cannot feel it. And it seems to be completely abandoned, with no sign of any workers or performers. It is quieter inside. He cannot hear the birds. The leaves that rustled around his feet on the outside have not followed him past the fence, though there is room enough for the breeze to carry them through the bars. Bailey wonders which way he should go, and what might count as proof for his dare. There doesn't seem to be anything to take, only bare ground and smooth striped sides of tents. The tents look surprisingly old and worn in the light, and he wonders how long the circus has been traveling and where it goes when it leaves. He thinks there must be a circus train, though there is not one at the station, and as far as he can tell, no one ever sees such a train come or go. Bailey turns right at the end of the passage, finds himself in a row of tents, each with a door and a sign advertising its contents. Flights of Fancy reads one, Ethereal Enigmas another. Bailey holds his breath as he passes the one marked Fearsome Beasts and Strange Creatures, but he hears nothing from inside. He finds nothing to take with him, as he is unwilling to steal a sign, and the only other things out in plain sight are scraps of paper and the occasional smushed piece of popcorn. The afternoon sun casts long shadows across the tents, stretching over dry ground. The ground has been painted or powdered white in some areas, black in others. Bailey can see the brown dirt beneath that has been kicked up by so many feet walking over it. He wonders if they repaint it every night. As he turns another corner, and because he's looking at the ground, he nearly runs into the girl. She's standing in the middle of the path between the tents, just standing there as though she's waiting for him. She looks to be about his own age, and she wears what only can be described as a costume, as they certainly aren't normal clothes. White boots with lots of buttons, white stockings, and a white dress made from bits of every fabric imaginable, scraps of lace and silk and cotton all combined into one, with a short white military jacket over it, and white gloves. Every inch of her from her neck down is covered in white, which makes her red hair exceptionally shocking. "You're not supposed to be here," the red-haired girl says quietly. She does not sound upset or even surprised. Bailey blinks at her a few times before he manages to respond. I know, he says, and it sounds to him like the stupidest thing in the world to say, but the girl only looks at him. "I'm sorry?" He adds, which sounds even stupider. "You should probably leave before anyone sees you," the girl says, glancing over her shoulder, but Bailey cannot tell what she's looking for. "Which way did you come in?" "Back, Bailey turns around, but cannot tell which way he came. The path turns in on itself, and he cannot see any of the signs to know which ones he had passed. "I'm not sure," he says. "That's all right. Come with me." The girl takes his hand in her white-gloved one and pulls him down one of the passageways. She doesn't say anything more as they walk through the tents, though she makes him stop when they reach a corner, and they do not move for almost a minute. When he opens his mouth to ask what they're waiting for, she simply holds her finger up to her lips to quiet him, and then continues walking a few seconds later. "You can fit through the fence?" the girl asks, and Bailey nods. The girl takes a sharp turn behind one of the tents, down a passageway Bailey had not even noticed, and there's the fence again, and the field outside. "Go out this way," the girl says. "You should be fine." She helps Bailey squeeze through the bars, which are a bit tighter in this part of the fence. When he's on the other side, he turns around to face her. "Thank you," he says. He cannot think of what else to say. "You're welcome," the girl says, "but you should be more careful. You're not supposed to come in here during the day. It's trespassing." "I know, I'm sorry," Bailey says. "What does exsanguinated mean?" The girl smiles. "It means draining all your blood," she says, "but they don't actually do that, I don't think." She turns and starts down the passageway. "Wait," Bailey says, though he doesn't know what he's asking her to wait for. The girl returns to the fence. He does not respond. She doesn't not respond, just waits to hear what he has to say. I'm supposed to bring something back," he says, and regrets it instantly. The girl's brow furrows as she stares at him through the bars. "Bring something back," she repeats. "Yeah," Bailey says, looking down at his scuffed brown shoes and at her white boots on the other side of the fence. "It was a dare," he adds, hoping she'll understand. The girl smiles. She bites her lip for a second and looks thoughtful, and then pulls off one of her white gloves and hands it to him through the bars. Bailey hesitates. "It's okay, take it," she says. "I have a whole box of them." Bailey takes the white glove from her and puts it in his pocket. "Thank you," he says. "You're welcome, Bailey," the girl says, and this time when she turns away, he does not say anything, and she disappears behind the corner of the striped tent. Bailey stands there for a long time before he walks back across the field. There's no one left in the oak tree when he reaches it, only a great deal of acorns on the ground, and the sun is starting to set. He's halfway home when he realizes he never told the girl his name. Oh man, the next page is one that I've bookmarked. Because in one of my creative writing classes in college, we got done with our assignments early that semester, and so the teacher was like, bring in a book you like, and read one of your favorite passages. And, you know, we went around the circle and read them. And I was just like, I don't know what to do. Look at how many passages I marked. No, I know which one I chose. I chose the Cloud Maze. We'll get to that soon. It's amazing.